Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place where we have great conversations, learn about fun new tech, and talk with some great folks. And I'm super excited for my guest today because a guest that I've known for a bit. We used to work together a lot. We still work at Microsoft together, but we're in different sides of the world. I want to introduce my friend Sam. Sam, say hello. Introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. How's it going? How are you, Isaac?
I'm doing great. Sam, do you want to just do a little quick intro of what you do at Microsoft and all that sort of great stuff?
Sure. So my name is Sam Smith. I am not a singer, in case you're asking. I've been at Microsoft about 3 years. I work in the developer support group, which is a field group which manages developer contracts for our enterprise customers, helping them be better at software development, I guess is the easiest way of putting it. So we help modernize applications, mostly with .NET, but really anything. We help migrate workloads to Azure, and my personal favorite is help them transform DevOps and improve their developer productivity.
Yeah, I mean, so for a little bit of background, Sam and I used to be on the same team. We used to work in the field together. And when I used to talk about my job, when I had that job, I used to say customer-aligned developer advocate, right? So at the end of the day, responsibility is to make sure customers are getting the most out of their developers and, being as productive as possible. And it's funny that I equate that because these terms like developer velocity and developer productivity are very, very top of mind in, the developer technology world right now. And I think one of the things that we always talk about, especially with customers, is how effective, what is the low-hanging fruits that you can do to kind of optimize yourself. And like you mentioned, DevOps is one of them. And I want to talk about DevOps a little bit. But first, I want to talk a little bit about Sam. So Sam, do you remember kind of the first time you came across technology or came across open source and it kind of, your brain lit up and you're like, this is something that I'm really interested in. I want to continue to do this?
Well, two questions there.
Sure.
So let's talk about technology first, because open source happened a lot later. My first exposure to technology was a Commodore 64 my parents brought in, probably 1985 or 86.
Okay.
We had to load games, mostly games, with cassette tapes. It's pretty crazy that any of that worked back then. But I didn't really start, working with technology, I would say, properly until we got sort of a 386. Sort of 4 or 5 years later, digital 386 SX. It's like 2 megs of RAM or 4 megs of RAM, I don't even remember. And that was when I started to write basic programs, right, and start to experiment with computers. And I think it was really, my original dream was to be like a game developer,
Sure.
Right? I played the games of the day, and I thought I want to do this. And then so I went to university with that dream, and then the reality of what they have to do sunk in. And so I graduated from university, and my first job in year 2000, like a couple months after Y2K, pretty grim market, was developing VB6 applications, which was almost completely the opposite of game development.
Sure.
You can't be further from it. And I was terrible at it. But I kept chipping away, and then in 2003, I moved to the States, and I started learning .NET Framework. Originally with VB.NET, but we moved to C# sort of 2008, 2009, and then from there the sky has been the limit. I've really sort of enjoyed that sort of development.
Sure. It's always funny because I think a lot of us, when we, if we're people that are interested in technology, and when you're kids, your example with I want to be a game developer, I hear that a lot where it's like, oh, I want to be a game developer because it's so much fun, just the thought of building games and getting to play games all day. And then you're in the professional world and you're like, oh, being a game developer is not a fun job a lot of times, right? You hear all the horror stories. And but it's funny because when we go, when most people, when they get a real job, so to speak, it's kind of like the same job, just different situation. You're writing some application that hits some data source that does some things, right? In the grand scheme of things. And it's always funny that it's I wanted to be a game developer, and then I end up being kind of like what every other developer is. And I'm always interested in knowing occasionally, obviously, with knowing now how hard it is to be a game developer, is this something that you occasionally still think about? It's like, oh, I wonder if I could do that, or is it something that you have no interest in anymore?
No, it's actually still something I play with on weekends.
Yeah.
Right? Because I have Unity 3D
Sure.
and I fire it up because it works with C# now.
Yep.
Right? And I play. But I'm always, even with those tools, I'm always blown away by how complex graphics are.
Yeah.
And it's a different world. It's like making a movie, right? It sounds easy, but when you really get into the details of lighting and sound and editing, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that you don't see, which isn't as fun as playing the game. And I think it's important to separate the fun of doing something versus making something, and they can both be fun, but it's very different stories.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I think, I remember when I was in college, he wasn't really a friend. He was somebody that was, we took classes together and we occasionally would hang out, but I wouldn't say that we were friends. And this is when I was in college, it was right after Half-Life, and Counter-Strike became the only things that people did on computers, right? From a gaming perspective. And he built completely by himself, the 3D modeling, everything. He built a mod for Counter-Strike that was in the universe of Battlefield or Battlestar Galactica. With the giant spider aliens and all that sort of stuff, and it looked really, really good. And I always think about that occasionally. I'm like, man, the amount of effort that it would take to do something like that, and he just did it as enjoyment out of his spare time, right? I mean, I think it just goes to show the level of if you're interested about something, you'll just figure out how to do it and eventually become proficient in it, right?
And it really is the bleeding edge too, right? If you look at what the models were back when you were in college, right?
Yeah.
How many polygons they had versus now. I mean, now you play Assassin's Creed or something, and you can see each individual blade of grass blowing on your 4K TV. It's crazy. So you even look back to what they were doing in university, and you think, wow, that was easy. It wasn't that complex. Because it really is. It's the bleeding edge of technology. They do everything before anyone else.
Yeah.
It's wild.
It's everything too, right? It's I happened to talk to somebody who works on the Xbox team at Microsoft, and their responsibility was solely making sure the graphics card drivers were working at 100%, at all times, right? That's their job. I can imagine that's a very painful job, but they were talking to me about how it's you're always getting these bits, and you're always getting this stuff from vendors like Nvidia, for instance, and it's always just trying to make sure that whatever happens, it still works on the Xbox, right? The games don't crash, whatever, right? All this dependency on everything, drivers, hardware, and then that's just getting it to actually show stuff on the screen. Then you actually have to do really, really sophisticated stuff. I mean, I could not imagine being a game developer. I don't think I have the temperament for it. I think I would lose my mind, to be completely honest. But I think that go ahead.
No, you expect that they have a pretty nice suite of automated tests, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you would hope,
Yeah.
but still, things change, and how do you test a polygon on a screen? Right.
It's a great question. It's funny that you bring this up. Not testing polygons, but testing in general, right? And this is so Sam and I both work at Microsoft, so this is a Microsoft thing. But so Microsoft published a blog post a few months ago about how Blizzard uses Visual Studio and WSL to debug Diablo 4, right? That runs on servers, right? And they had this entire really sophisticated process to make sure that when a server crashes, they know exactly what's going on. And I was reading the blog, and I didn't know 90% because I don't know anything about Linux really from debugging standpoint. I don't know a lot about the inner workings of game development, but at the core principles, I thought, wow, this is a lot of work just to get a line that the exception through, right? And I mean, it's challenging. I think that there's also something to say that if you have the right tools and if you figure out how to work with the right tools, it becomes easier. and you have like obviously people on your team that are experts in it, but like I'd imagine like onboarding onto that team, it's terrifying, right? Like, okay, so you do this and then you do this and you download this 3 gigabyte file from this server and then like you unpack it. Like it's a lot, right?
Yeah, I remember Valve when they released one of the Half-Life expansions. I think it was Half-Life Episode 2 or something. They actually released heat maps of where every player dies in all the levels.
Sure.
They track telemetry of everything across, to help them understand, how difficult a piece was, or where there was maybe a bug where people were dying unexpectedly. And I always thought that was like a fascinating, like, because when you design your applications, right, being able to debug it is everything.
Yep.
And it's so hard. I mean, that's why a lot of us look at things like microservices and we say, this sounds great, but now you have all this extra complexity because now you're debugging 100 microservices instead of one monolith. And it's a balance. There are advantages either way, but that telemetry is just so critical, setting it up properly for each application.
Yeah.
So I know you're into that stuff.
Into what? To microservices? Telemetry.
Telemetry.
Oh, I love telemetry. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's funny that you bring up telemetry because it's one of those things, at least, and I've grown around this thought for a while now, probably 2 or 3 years, because I've been talking about telemetry at conferences and internally for a while now. And I think, at least how I've always assumed that telemetry was something that everybody can take advantage of. And I'm starting to learn now more and more that depending on the use case, telemetry is very valuable. But in other use cases, it's not valuable at all. I had a conversation with somebody, it was probably a few months ago now, about like going down the rabbit hole of like when you're trying to debug like a very complex thing, right? And like, sure, telemetry can be excruciatingly helpful, but like if your telemetry is giving you wrong information and you're working off that wrong information, you're having a hard time. So it's not as simple, and I know that a lot of tools talk about how easy it is to light up telemetry and all of that, but there's this responsibility that we have as developers and as operations engineers and all these folks to like understand the data that our apps are creating, right? Not just as simple as like, okay, well, here's some error logs and here's some info logs and all that stuff, but like really truly understand, like you should be able, and this is probably unfair, but you should have a pretty good understanding of like where your code is doing stuff, like based just looking at a couple of lines of telemetry, right? And sure, there's great like graphical tools that help you out with that, but it's still this thing where I think a lot of people just expect like you light up some service for your app, whether it's something that's cloud-based or you have some instrumentation agent that runs on the server that your app is on, and it's just magically like, hey, now whenever I have an exception, it'll be fine because I can just look at the error log. Or, oh, if something is slow, or if people aren't coming to a feature route of my app. It's not as simple as that, right? I equate it a little bit to like DevOps, and I find it funny now that like telemetry and things like that are now kind of included in the DevOps story, about how it's not just simple as like a tool fixing a problem, right? It's a combination of, changing the culture at a company, changing the mindset of how the development team works, and then finally like choosing a tool that fits your work stream the best, right? And I know you and I have had this conversation, especially around DevOps, a lot, right? Where, if it was just a tools issue, like there wouldn't be, like DevOps wouldn't be such a thing, but it's not a tools thing, right?
Yeah, no, tools is just a small part of the problem, but we still see it today, right? People adopt these, GitHub and Jira and all these products because they think it's going to solve their problem, but it typically doesn't. It's the way that people use the tools.
Yeah, I always have this conversation. So I'm fortunate enough to speak at EBCs at Microsoft, which are executive briefing committees for the folks tuning in. Basically, you get to present to customers about some of the great things Microsoft does, and I do a lot of talks in the DevOps space, and I always like when, and how am I going to phrase this? When I'm approached on like, okay, so what are you going to talk about? The account teams are, for a particular customer will reach out to me and I'll say, well, I'm going to talk about no tools for an hour. And they look at me and they're like, well, that's I mean, how do you talk about not like DevOps is just tools? I'm like, well, no, it's not just tools. And then I give them my pitch and like, okay, whatever. And the conversations that I have with customers is very interesting because a lot of customers are expecting like Microsoft to come in and say, hey, you have to use Azure DevOps, you have to use GitHub, you have to use all these tools in Azure, right? And I just start off by saying like, you need to think about how your team works and how your team it works efficiently. And it's very challenging for customers because you're kind of reorging like from a mental standpoint. And the conversations are always great, but I've always been fascinated by people taking the advice or taking the concepts because I don't like to give advice during these things, but actually implementing them because I'll follow up and be like, hey, did you ever finish? Like they're like, oh, they tried and it was too hard, or oh, they're using tool X and they're fine now, because it is painful, extremely painful.
Yes, the danger of DevOps today too is everyone thinks it's something else, and now everyone has tried it.
Yeah.
Well, most people have, and so they say, well, yeah, we tried unit tests, they didn't work for us.
Yeah.
And it's I've started to come around to the idea of, look, we can't adapt DevOps to your organization. You can't change the way it works. DevOps is a movement, it's a journey, it's a set of behaviors that you have to do differently, and you really need to ask the organization to completely transform to become DevOps, rather. Yeah, and that's where I think people make the mistake, right? They go, well, we don't really need unit tests, our application is special.
Yeah.
we can just write a different type of automated test and we'll be fine. And then they come to us and say, so when I change a line of code, it takes me 72 hours before I get any feedback.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard for them to understand how they could do that better, and it takes a while.
Yeah.
It's a hard conversation. Yeah, it's probably the hardest thing we do, right?
Yeah.
I actually don't think of us as being technology people anymore.
Yeah.
I think of us as being change management agents.
Sure.
Like,
that's fair.
we're just constantly going into companies and saying, yeah, this tool will help you, but we're really here to help you transform and move to the next generation.
Yeah, and I don't want to bang on the tools drum too hard, but like tools sometimes make it worse too. Right? There's a lot of great tools out there. You bring up testing, for instance, right? Like there's a lot of tools that make testing easier, but like writing a bunch of unit tests doesn't really help anything, right? Like I've worked in consulting gigs before I joined Microsoft where like, before like any code was shipped, there's like 4,000 unit tests, right? Like testing like every little piece, and it's like, okay, so all the checks are green, that's awesome, but like you wasted a lot of time like before you even had like an MVP, like a minimum viable product, right? So like, there's a lot of effort into making sure that like test-driven design is very, very important, but like you don't want like TDD to slow down your development process. You want it to help augment it. So when you do get to a point where you're having issues, it's very, very easy to resolve, and and issues don't get to the point where you need to resolve them, right? But again, it's one of those things where like people think tools fix everything, or like concepts or design patterns or practices around testing fix everything too.
Everything's a pendulum, right?
Yeah.
And people tend to go from one side to the other instead of stopping in the middle.
Yeah.
And you mentioned TDD. I mean, people look at TDD, test-driven development, and they go, that's great. Oh, but look, behavior-driven testing is even better.
Yeah.
Let's do that. But both of them are really hard.
Yeah.
And a lot of organizations can't even implement sort of test-driven development, let alone like automated testing.
Yeah.
It's the first major roadblock of DevOps usually is automated testing. So it's hard to ask people, hey, slow down, focus on this first. Let's automate your testing. Let's convert your testing teams and make them feel confident that what we're doing is not trying to, there's the common misconception, of course, is with QA managers is we're going to automate away all your QA people.
Sure.
That's not the goal, right? We just want to automate their regression tests so they can focus on the new feature.
Yeah.
Testing the new feature.
Or it's as simple as like I worked at a company that did just that, right? Like they brought in a suite of test tools and they actually laid off a lot of quality assurance analysts, right? And I remember vividly, it became substantially harder for things to ship because, Unfortunately, and I'm guilty of it as a developer, I'm guessing you're guilty of a developer as well, like we hate fixing our own bugs. Like we hate it because it's not enjoyable, it's not innovative, it's not creative, it's not whatever analogy you want to put in, like it's not exciting. So like going back, and that loop is challenging, right? Where you push a change, you wait for some tests, you come back, and there's like, at least with a quality assurance person, they can batch things up for you, right? Or maybe there's a particular reason why. And automated tests are great, don't get me wrong. I love automated tests, but at the same time, we shouldn't be 100% dependent on automated tests to get us from point A to point B. There's great tests, like there's things like Selenium and Playwright and these tests that like do a lot of like web user automated testing. But does that mean that you don't need those folks anymore? No, because they're far more nuanced than a machine could ever be. And
yeah, you definitely need them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. It's definitely interesting, and I love how we started to talk about DevOps just naturally because you and I love talking about DevOps. When, at least from your perspective, like when you were working, and when did you really think that like this DevOps thing is something that I need to pay attention to? I need to be far more, I don't want to say involved, but far more interested in the topics that are going on inside of my organization.
Yeah, so it's funny because I resisted DevOps for a couple of years. Yeah. I remember distinctly sort of around 2010, we hired a developer who came and said, we need to set up CI/CD, we need to set up automated testing. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I resisted it because I sort of felt like, hey, look, this is just another thing that we're going to set up. And we'd created automated testing before, and of course, we didn't create them quality tests, yeah. And so they tended to be based on a database state sure. of that day. Yeah. So you ran them a week or a month later, and there was a whole lot of failures. And so we just started to ignore those failures, and then the tests were failed. It wasn't until like 2017, relatively recently, Donovan Brown at one of I think it was the Build conference in Seattle. And I remember coming back from that conference and sitting down with my manager at the time and saying, I think there's something in this DevOps sure. we should spend a bit of time sort of looking into it. And that ever since then, that's sort of been yeah. my whole career. Yeah. Like I just love it. I love the continuous improvement. I love how it makes your software better. I love that it's not just tools, that it's like processes and people and changing behaviors. And yeah. I think it's fascinating to talk about problems with people and say, well, actually, this is not a technology problem. This is a people problem. And some people love that and some people don't.
I mean, it's hard,
we're
right?
Picking on people's flaws.
Yeah,
it's really hard.
Because that's what it really yeah. is, right? It's, yeah. pointing out the flaws in human behavior, right? I talk about this all the time. Like people naturally, like we have an affliction. We're not interested in change. We don't like change. So when change is introduced into our environment, we typically, we tend to just be very anti whatever this new thing is, right? And when you come into an organization, you say, okay, by the way, like your development teams aren't structured properly to be far more agile, right? Like that's like one of the number one things that companies have issues with when they're trying to adopt DevOps practices, right? Is like they need to understand that it's like you can't have database team and front end team and web service A team and whatever, right? Like it's more, you need to have kind of a more development lifecycle centric team, where you have people that are responsible for building tools and then for testing tools and owning product tools, like all like within one group working together. And for a lot of companies, like they're just not structured organizationally to take on those things. So like the first response that you usually get is, oh, well, I mean, that's too hard. Like we can't reorg our entire company and move like all these non-developers into developer teams and so forth. And it's like, so it's not like that. But when you build products, the people that are a part of the meetings that are building these products, they all need to you need to handle like 4 or 5 roles, right? And it's not like as simple as like, oh, this is a database issue, I'll throw it over to the database team and they'll just fix it. Because that's wrought for more traditional approaches for, handling things in the IT world, right?
I had a project that I worked on for a year where every Friday, we thought we were being agile. We packaged up that product and released it to QA. It took us everywhere from about 2 or 3 hours to 8 or 9 hours every Friday.
Sure.
That's a team of 6 or 7, right? Now, if we'd automated that, like the amount of productivity, we had the same conversations that you just had. Hey, we don't have time to do this. Like, we don't have the correct, expertise. It's going to be hard. Whereas if you can save a developer 10 minutes a day, that's roughly 40 hours a year.
Yeah.
And now, if I'd taken that to that project, we probably would have saved each developer 4 hours a week. That would have been like months of extra development time.
Yeah.
And that's where I found testing, particularly as an enterprise, but also as an individual. Like when I'm working on my open source products, my little side projects, open source ones, I need that automated testing to do my work. If someone wants to submit a change, I need to know if it's a quality change. I need to know if it's going to break everything. Plus, I don't remember what I did yesterday, let alone last week.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
If I'm working on these open source projects at a part-time sort of basis, I need to know that when I jump back into it after not looking at it for 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months, that the change I'm making is not going to break all of my other regression tests. Yeah. And so that's where DevOps and automated testing, I think, is crucial for open source software.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point too, right? And I think that there's tons of great tools to kind of help facilitate that mindset, right? Where primarily open source projects that are on GitHub or wherever, right? They're people that are doing this because they enjoy doing it, not because they're getting paid to do it. So, the more barriers those individuals have to innovate on top of these ideas, the less likely these ideas are ever going to be consumed by the greater community. Like anybody who's been on GitHub knows that go to a repo and it might have 500 stars, but the last commit was from 2017. And you're like, okay, because nobody removes stars from a nobody goes and cleans up their stars, the projects they've started, right? So there is a lot of, repo roulette, right? Where you come in and you're like, okay, is this repo going to work for me? Oh, I haven't seen there's a commit in a long time. I don't think that the people manage this anymore. Is it even worth me getting? And then depending on the technology, even just making sure that stuff works for you is challenging. So it's excruciatingly important to make sure that when people come to your repos or they come to your little softwares that you've built, that it's clear what the responsibility is of the person who runs it and the persons who are contributing to it, whether they're opening issues or whatever, right? I talk about this all the time. Maintainer burnout is very, very true. And like you mentioned, if I go in after not playing around with my little project for a month, and then I try to build it and it fails, and I have no idea why, because the .NET preview changed, or your node packages need to get updated, your npm packages need to get updated. It becomes you spend an hour just trying to get your shit to work, right? And that's I've been very guilty of it, where it's okay, I'm gonna spend an hour working on open source project A, and then I come to it and I spend 25 minutes just getting the thing working, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm done, I guess. I don't have any more time. I mean, that's not a good way to innovate.
Right?
What was that?
Not just the product, it's your dependencies as well.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm consuming some random npm package that in the last month since I've worked on the project upgraded from version 3 to version 4. Mm-hmm. If I don't have good tests to validate that, because let's be honest as well, I use an open source product, I'm probably using 1% of it, maybe 2% of it.
Yeah.
If I don't understand exactly what I'm using and how I'm using it and have some really simple tests to sort of validate that how I use that dependency, I can come in, I can update my npm packages, and then 5 other things break that I don't even understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard.
I had this conversation a couple of weeks ago with somebody where it's turtles all the way down, right? NPM is great, but NPM also introduces this level of obfuscation that is troubling for me personally, because I don't know how NPM works, how NPM works. I understand it holistically. I understand there's some, Python wheel files that get downloaded and built out and extract file. I understand all of that. I understand that, but the concept was I check out a package, I install a package, and that package has dependencies that are other packages, and then all the way down, right? So you're very dependent on not just the work of that one npm package that you're downloading, but you're dependent on the work of literally that npm package in every dependency down the dependency tree, all the way to God knows what. And if one thing, yeah,
there's a meme about that. Have you seen that meme where it has the stacked items, and then at the very bottom, it's got sort of like a little guy that says updated by some guy in Nebraska thanklessly since 2003.
Yeah,
that's exactly what it's like.
Yeah, and it's hard because what happens if somebody takes a dependency and then that maintainer decides to just not care anymore, which is a thing. Mm-hmm. But also, like we've seen this in the news, like somebody will inject some bad stuff into a very, very well-known npm package, and guess what happens, right? Literally immediately, like millions of npm packages now have like are compromised, right? Mm-hmm. The model itself is great because it embraces collaboration, it embraces reuse and open source and to an extent inner source and all these great terms, right? But you become so dependent on the work of others that you can a large company could literally be railroaded or stop on a dime because of some, like you're some guy in Nebraska 2016, right? Like, do you like for a company, like a huge company, is it safe to take on those risks? That like, oh, like if all of a sudden if like this particular API call doesn't work, and we find out that like some guy in Nebraska, like, do you contribute and fix that guy's thing? Do you move on to a different package? Do you like, it's scary, right?
It's the modern day COBOL, right?
Yeah.
Like some of these projects, I wonder what percentage of them are already dead, that the person just stopped maintaining them for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But other applications still consume them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's also like, there is, I've talked about this too, where open source like you create an open source project and you have an idea, and that you're never really done, because people are always coming in and maybe introducing new things or asking for different subtle API changes or whatever, right? And that's fine. But for some like very, very small things, like there doesn't need to be a ton more added to it. So even like from a maintainer standpoint, is like, I just need to check this repo like once a month to make sure that things work.
Yeah.
And that's where things start to become challenging. It's like, I've done everything that I want to do. And there isn't an expectation that I'm going to go out and literally implement every request or every ask from every single person that uses my thing. I think that it's done, so it's done to me. But it's never really done, because there's always going to be bugs introduced with the new version of Node or the new version of .NET or a new version of Java or whatever, right? There's always going to be new bugs introduced. So it becomes extremely important for everybody involved in an open source chain, whether it be a maintainer or even the large enterprise, like be aware of what your apps are doing and what their dependencies are, and have an understanding, right? Like, does that mean that you need to like open up issues in, these mega packages that literally have, they're used by millions and millions of other packages? No, but you need to be aware that there could be potential risk there, right?
Yeah, I need to be. I think we're all probably pretty bad at this, but at the same time,
sure.
Right? I mean, when you look at your packages, how often do you go down the chain? I mean, I know I don't. I go down like one level. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very guilty of it. That like I talk about like open source as a commodity, right? Where it's like I come to a package and I say, oh, this package might work for me. And then I go through the entire pomp and circumstance of seeing if it works, downloading the code or installing the npm package or whatever, right? And then it doesn't work for me. What do? I go to the next one, right? So the hard work of some person or a few people, like I just completely like throw in the garbage because it doesn't work for me in my one particular use case, right? And that's also very challenging and scary, right? Because you don't want to be in a position where you're discounting the work of people because it's not satisfying your need at that one particular point. And humans are guilty of this all the time, right? But it's something that I try really, really hard to be mindful of. So if I'm using a package, like I go and I look at like, and it's hard, like I try to go like one or two levels down like you, but even then it's like, okay, I trust you at this point. And that's giving a lot of trust to somebody you don't know what their name is, you don't know anything about them.
Yeah. I have you heard the story about I think it was Martin Winwood who brought it up first in that Microsoft has at least 13 XML parsers internally.
Sure. Yeah.
13, at least 13 teams have written it, and there's probably more. There's probably more, like 15 or 16 of them have rewritten this piece of code, which is essentially all the same.
Sure.
Or they looked at their next teams over and don't want to do it this way. I want to do it differently.
Yeah.
That inefficiency is wild to me. That's crazy. That you think about the number of hours the teams have spent, resolving bugs that the other teams probably have as well. And that's where inner sourcing is an interesting concept for an enterprise, right? Because I feel like sometimes you talk about open source with an enterprise and they say, no, we're not doing open source here. We're not using GitHub. We're not publishing our code online.
Yep, sure.
And you have to have that reset conversation of, well, your code is still private, and inner sourcing is sort of a internal open source concept where you're trying to prevent things like, XML, writing the same code 13 times and encouraging people to dive in and make improvements to code. I mean, it's the dream, right? If you find a bug, I do this all the time with Microsoft documentation. I can dive in there. I can, create a pull request and submit a suggestion to improve it.
Sure.
That community stuff is so powerful. It makes you feel like, if I fix this problem, it's going to help the next person. That's what I like about open source.
Yeah, when I talk about, like, you bring up inner source, which I think is always an interesting conversation because it's defined very well, but I think a lot of people don't really understand the goals, right? If you've been a developer for more than probably 5 or 6 years, maybe 10 years, let's just say that. If you've been a developer for more than 10 years, you have been in situations where your app that you're building goes out to some file share somewhere and includes a DLL as a reference or a jar file in a reference. And you don't know what that code is. It's code that's built by some other team and you're like just hoping it works because they told you it works, right? And I bring this up a lot because it's the easiest way. Wouldn't it be great if instead of just getting that file, you had access to all that file source code, and you can have conversations with that team that's building that dependency, whether it be a DLL or a jar file or whatever, right? You have that communication. So like if you need an API change, it's easy. If you need, a bug fix, it's easy. It's not sending an email and maybe it's, maybe it's an email or maybe it's something else. But I think at the end of the day, it's taking that concept of like, hey, I'm grabbing this thing from some place that I don't know what it does, and making the visibility of what's going on in that thing more present. And that also opens up the ability to share it amongst other teams, right? Because some teams might say, I don't know what that DLL does, and I don't want to talk to that team because I've had issues in the past with that team. Now, like, that DLL, I can go and look at what it actually does, and maybe it's helpful for my team, and maybe it's not. Right? I think that's.
And being able to submit a pull request is different than going to a team and saying I wanted to do this as well.
Yes.
And I found that's a major shift in mentality, because if I go to you and say, Isaac, your presence light application, can you do this feature, this feature, this feature?
Mm-hmm.
And it's up to you to say, like, that's a great idea, but I don't have time. I've got a family. I'm busy, right? Yeah. But if I come to you with a pull request and said, hey, I had this idea, what do you think? I mean, most of the time you're going to say, great idea, and add it in, right?
Yeah. I mean, and Sam brings up Presence Light because for Presence Light, for folks that don't know, I built a little tool that updates your lights based on your team presence, right? Like not super, super exciting, but for some reason people love it. And yeah, I've had people come in and they've been like, yeah, I would love to help. And I'm like, I'm definitely interested in people helping. And I've had some people that come in. I've also had some people that have came in and they've thought that the way that I've written code is not ideal. So they submit pull request, or they send me an email or whatever saying like, I'm thinking about opening up a pull request. Like, these are the things that I'm looking to do. And I will say, that's great, but I'm probably not going to accept that PR because it's not readable for me anymore. Right? I'm the first to say that I'm not the greatest developer. I'm an okay developer. And some concepts are completely outside of my breadth. And what that means is that if somebody contributes to my project and it makes it harder for me to build it, even though it's my project, it's not helpful. Like, even if you're adding some cool feature or doing some cool thing, like, I mean, maybe that's selfish of me, but like at the end of the day, like, they're going to come into my project, maybe help me out for a little bit and then disappear, never come back. And I'm stuck with that code, yep. Right? And it's hard because you're saying no to people who are trying to help. They think they're trying to help, but sometimes maybe they're really not. Maybe they're just trying to make it easier for them to contribute in the future, which is totally fine. But it's challenging, right? It's one of those things.
They're probably
having.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm finished. It was just basically, it's challenging putting yourself in a position where you're asking for contribution, but the contribution has to be right.
Yeah, right for you. Yeah, because that person's probably looking at your code thinking, I don't understand what Isaac's written.
Yeah, I mean, and let's be completely real. Like, Isaac looks at Isaac's code, he doesn't know what's going on. So,
well, no, and Sam does the same thing with Sam's code. That's why I was talking about the automated tests being my crutch now. And I don't know what it's going to be like when I'm a developer in my 50s or 60s, but as a developer in my 40s, it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we get more experienced as technologists, like we gravitate towards things that are going to reduce the level of pain, because there is a level of pain that always exists as being somebody in technology, because there's this constant stream of failure. So ways to reduce the pain or reduce the amount or the consistency of failure is like the job, right? Whether that be tools or practices that you bring in or what have you, right? It's very, very important to kind of feel comfortable in the pain, and tools and different things help that. But they're not going to make all the pain go away, because if all the pain went away, like, you wouldn't have a job anymore. Because we're only here as developers and technologists because there is some pain, right? Because if every piece of software worked 100% every single time it was shipped, there would be no more developers, right? Robots would build everything. So
no, that's very true. But there are like also 100 ways to skin the cat, right? Yep. And I see developers who are like, I need a key vault to store the secrets for my other key vault, or I need dependency injection to abstract away my dependency injection in my other project. Like, you can make things super complicated.
Oh yeah.
For no real benefit.
Yeah.
Right? And I've taken it the opposite way, where I'll be like, I could use a link statement here, or I could just write a for loop. I'm going to write a for loop because I can read this later.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And I avoid regex like the plague.
Oh, yeah.
Because when I look at that later, I have no idea.
Yeah,
like, if I have to change it, I'm rewriting it.
Yeah,
right?
and Visual Studio has actually gotten kind of good, where it'll tell you, like, you'll hover over a regex statement, and it'll tell you kind of what it's trying to do. But even like the humanified, like, regex statements, like, you're like, okay, well, I copy and pasted this from Stack Overflow, so I hope it works. It's really funny because I had something and I lost it. But I think one of the things that's really, really interesting too is, you mentioned a couple of times that you have a couple of projects that you've built. And funny enough, like, I actually use those projects a lot. You probably don't know about this. Like, you built a tool that kind of translates, like, YAML files from one schema to another schema, right? So for the folks who don't know, I'll paste into the chat, but Sam wrote this little parser that basically takes your Azure Pipelines base YAML files, which is a CI/CD process that exists in Azure DevOps, and he converted them, and it converts them to GitHub Actions, which is GitHub Actions GitHub Actions approach. And I use it a lot because I have a lot of Azure Pipeline stuff that I've migrated over, but I also do it when I talk with people about how, like, simple tools make things substantially easier when moving from things to like, because there's these, like, it's a fairly large paradigm shift to go from Azure DevOps to GitHub if you decide to do that. And if you do, like, the changes in, like, some things are very easy. Like, it's just clicking here, clicking there. Sometimes it's harder. And, like, tools that, like, what you've built is, like, it definitely reduces the barrier to entry to migrate to new tools if needed. And like, I'd love for you to kind of talk about like why you decided to build a tool like that, right? Was it just because like you wanted to get more familiar with the differences in schema? Was it something that you saw, oh, like I think people would appreciate this? Because I've shared it, with my friends over here. I shared it with a lot of people, and every single person that sees it, they're like, oh, this is awesome. I didn't even know this existed. And it's one of those things where it's like, why don't you talk about it more, Sam? Just kidding.
It's a good question. So I started writing this thing probably a year and a half ago, right? November 2019, I think.
Sure.
It was I have a holiday hackathon over Thanksgiving every year where I hack at something by myself. So it was kind of a dream project from the perspective of I'm just taking text and I'm manipulating it. From the perspective, we've been talking about testing a lot today. I have a couple hundred unit tests that run in like 100 milliseconds, right?
Yeah.
I can get that instant feedback. Normally when you have a database and you have to sort of wait, for things to run. So it was fun to write. It was fun to sort of take advantage of some of those tools right from the very beginning. And I wrote it for me.
Sure.
I was like, same situation as you. Hey, I've got a lot of things over here. My customers starting to use GitHub. I need to learn it. I need to ramp up quickly. How do I do it? Well, I want to take something that I know that works, translate it, and try it. And that works because we know that the GitHub Actions was actually forked from Azure pipelines. So it's using the same original code base. So it's similar, right? It's like, sure. I don't know what's the equivalent, like Portuguese and Spanish. Maybe that's a bad example.
Yeah.
They have similarities.
Sure.
They're not exactly the same, and you can't read them, but you can understand roughly what's going on. And so, yeah, I still update it like every couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I have some, because it's an open source project, I didn't want to capture anyone's YAML in case they had secrets in there.
Sure.
So I purposely don't catch that. What I do catch is I catch unknown tasks. So if you pop in a task there, I capture that task and I throw that over to Application Insights.
Mm-hmm.
And like once a month, I go in there and I look for the last 30 days to see how often it has. And I track all of those in my GitHub issues where I say, this particular task failed 8 times over the last month or and 30 times in total. And that helps me to prioritize, what to update next.
Yeah.
But I've gotten some, I had another colleague from another part of Microsoft reach out to me and ask if he could help, and he submitted a couple PRs.
Yeah.
I've had a couple different people randomly in Microsoft and outside of Microsoft tell me about how helpful it's been, and that sort of, it's been my most successful open source project, even though it has like 30 stars or something.
It doesn't matter. The number of stars doesn't matter.
I don't care. I didn't create it to create stars or sell it for $1 million.
Yeah.
It's never going to be there.
But it's one of those things, and let's be completely honest, right? Like, it's one of those things where it's like, this tool should exist and it should be owned by somebody, like it shouldn't be Sam Smith's responsibility to build a tool like this, right? But again, I think that's what's really powerful about open source is you saw an opportunity. It's like, oh, I imagine this is very painful for people because it was painful for me. So I'm just going to build it, right? I mean, I've talked about this with Presence Light a lot, where it's like, something like this should just exist. I shouldn't have to build it. But I built it. Eventually, somebody will build a better version of it, and I will not be dependent on, people won't be dependent on some guy who lives in Washington State for this sort of tool, right?
Yeah. I've also been around for long enough that I kind of recognize that. So the GitHub Actions people, they're super smart. They're creating this new system. Mm-hmm. That's what they're focused on, right? They're not focused on Azure pipelines from that perspective. They're focused on Actions.
Yeah.
And so I've seen the pattern where the migration tool doesn't come for many years later.
Sure. Yeah.
For whatever reason, right? And it's probably on a roadmap somewhere over at GitHub to do this eventually. But I was like, I'm not going to wait for eventually. I want to do it today.
Yeah.
So like you said, I've got some pain. Let's solve it.
Yeah. And it's not complicated, right? It's just string parsing, right? At the end of the day, like
it is. Yeah, it is. Yeah. I use a couple dependencies, which are very important.
Yep.
And I've discovered that, and if people don't know this and they're listening, that all YAML can be converted to JSON, which is incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
So that's how I actually started with a YAML open source dependency and realized that Newtonsoft performed a little bit better.
Sure.
And I still use the YAML converter to create the output,
Yep.
but actually pass all the YAML with JSON, and yeah, it's fast. It's fun. I can go in there and I can add something, and I can see all the unit tests that fail, and then realize where I made a mistake with my coding, and I enjoy that part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one, and I'll just keep, continuing to talk about how this is something, like, I've always talked about this with people when either they build open source projects, or they're contributors to multiple projects, not from a maintenance standpoint, but I have no idea why we make Dependabot go away. Or not Dependabot, whatever. For whatever reason, it's blocking your thing. I pasted the GitHub repo in the chat. I'll paste the other thing in the chat. For some reason, you just got filtered out. But it's one of those things while I'm doing that. Yeah, I don't know why. Streamlabs. I don't even use Streamlabs.
I think it's because I logged into Twitch with my Facebook account.
Maybe. But I think so. It's one of those things. Well, let me finish my thought before I forget it. Like, productivity tools are things that, like, large companies hardly ever build, right? Unless they're productivity tools built around, like, a concept that's tied to a product they ship, right? Like, you don't see a lot of companies build productivity tools that are completely free that do things, right? Similar to like packages, right? Like, for instance, I've always thought this is very funny, like building a tool that interfaces with like 6 different light APIs, right? And the complete responsibility of the community to build like an SDK that works with that API is very funny to me. Because I'm like, well, if you own said smart light company, wouldn't you want developers to like build things on using your platform? And I figured out the answer is no. They don't care. They want you to buy the lights. So the developer ecosystem piece of it is completely like, whatever. It's cool, but it's not super exciting. So like, you have these people in the open source world that are like, hey, I have a whole bunch of these lights. I'm going to write some wrapper for the API because the API is like, it uses sockets and all sorts of silly things with like network discovery that I don't want people to have to worry about. So I'll just build it. And then you become like the de facto expert on said thing, and now you can't ever get away from it. And I just keep going back to this thought of like how like community enables like the greater, like, collaboration and open source allow the community at large to benefit. Because for the most part, and it's completely transparent, like enterprises and large organizations that ship, whether it's software, ship widgets, or ship things, like, they want you to buy the thing. They don't care as much about you using their products unless you're paying for it. Or there's some attach that allows you to use this free tool to connect to some tool that they can charge you money for, right?
Yeah, but developer productivity is so important, and it kind of blows my mind how often people haven't really internalized, how much you can improve work-life balance and create more value in your end products, right? It's win-win.
Yeah.
We were talking about game development before, right? I don't know if a lot of people realize that the first thing they do when they're creating a new game is create all these game tools, like a map editor or a model editor.
Yeah.
That is just as important as the end game, to sort of, build that thing out. And so developer productivity is, my perfect job is creating like developer tools, right?
Yeah. Well,
something like a Visual Studio, right?
Somewhat, right? Somewhat. I think as somebody who has seen a lot of how sausage gets made on building tools, right? It's like we talked about game development being very painful. Like, that is extremely painful. Because like, I think it was, I can't remember exactly who it was, but it was somebody on the Visual Studio team. They made a statement on a podcast that I listened to, and they said, when we move a setting from one place to another place, or we change the language of the setting, if it's a checkbox or make it a drop down or something. Like, people complain about that. And the only reason we're changing it is because we have telemetry that states that people are using this particular setting in this way. So we're trying to make it more effective for the majority of people. But the majority of people aren't the loudest. It's the minority that are being, I don't want to say, the minority the minority is always the loudest. Let's just say that. Like, the people that don't like your stuff is always the loudest, right? So it's always funny when even you hear things like Visual Studio folks going, "Oh, we moved a setting, or we changed this or whatever," and like we got more negative feedback than positive feedback, even though, you know, primarily people do this particular thing. But the people that got their cheese moved, to quote someone, it's like when your cheese gets moved, you get very upset, right?
Can't please all the people all the time, right?
It's very true.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. Yeah.
So we're about to wrap up, and one of the things that I first off, Sam, I want to thank you for hopping on it and chatting with me. This has been great. It's always nice to talk to you and talk about, you know, what you find interesting in technology, whether it's DevOps or different open source stuff, or just the changes that we need to make as technologists to better adapt to the times, right? Like, nobody should ever have to wait like 6 minutes for a build to finish, like locally on their machine. Like, that's something that's always very funny to me. When I first started, like, people would watch YouTube videos like while their apps are building. But like, again, it's super exciting to talk to you about these things. And for folks that don't follow Sam, he's pretty active on Twitter, pretty active on GitHub. I'll paste his alias into the chat, and obviously in the show notes for this, it'll be there. But Sam, as we wrap up, one of the things that I love to chat with about my guests, or ask them rather, is if you can think of open source or technology in general in one word, what would that word be for you?
I'm going to say productivity. I mean, how much time has open source saved me, right? With being able to use someone else's work and leverage that, it's everything. It's everything. Yeah. Way back to my first package. It was probably jQuery was my first real open source package.
jQuery was your first open source package?
I think so. What was yours?
I don't know. I mean, it probably was jQuery. I mean, I'm trying to remember like what my first like my first project job out of college was.
It would have been jQuery and then probably Bootstrap. Probably.
Well, actually, it was different. So, funny enough, so like my first like thing that I was assigned when I first graduated from college and got a job was like to pick a CMS system for the public-facing website of a very large insurance company. So like I was researching all these different CMS systems, right? And a lot of them were open source, obviously, like Orchard or Umbraco or whatever, right? And like I guess that was my first. I guess that was the first thing, because I used jQuery in college. I'm pretty sure, like for my like e-commerce classes, but I don't remember doing it. But I remember like the first time, like, oh, I'm going to Codeplex and I'm looking at this and I'm kind of getting understanding of like, so that, I think that was the first open source thing that came to me, was like CMS systems. But again, like I don't even think I really even understood at that point like what any of this was. Like, oh, the code's available, like I don't really care about that. I just want to like get a demo working locally. But yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought about that. I literally ask every guest that, and I never thought about it myself. Interesting. So anyway, well, as we're wrapping up, thank you, Sam, so much for joining me and chatting. Like, this was super fun. I'm glad that you were able to fit some time in your day to do it. For the folks that tuned in, thank you so much for checking us out and saying hello and all that sort of great stuff. This will be available on YouTube in a couple hours. So for everybody that's out there, enjoy the rest of your day and take care.
Thanks for having me, everyone.